Our third and final session is dedicated to contemporary African art and emerging art markets. The international market for contemporary African art has seen an explosion in the past 5 years, contributing $13 billion in revenue toward the global economy in 2018. While art fairs such as the 154 Art Fair, founded by panelist Touria El Glaoui in 2013, has played a major role in the international thirst for contemporary African art, the continent is also seeing an increase in its own markets, with several galleries and art fairs opening across the continent and in nearly all 54 countries. This panel will explore the role of the art markets both inside and outside of Africa and how this is spearheading more artists and galleries to remain on the continent. Our session moderator is Ayodeji Rotinwa, who is a Nigerian writer and critic who covers visual art, culture, social justice, and sustainable development. He's been published by the Financial Times, Art Forum, Roads and Kingdoms, amongst others. Ayodeji is editor-at-large for The Soul Adventurer. Joining Ayodeji is Touria El Glaoui. Born and raised in Morocco, Touria holds an MBA in Strategic Management and International Business from Pace University, New York. She began her career in the banking industry as a wealth management consultant before moving to London in 2001, where she undertook various business development positions in the telecom and IT industry. She spent over 5 years working between London, various African countries, and the Middle East within a business development framework. She is a member of the executive committee of the Friends of Leighton House, London, and a trustee of the Marrakech Biennial. In October 2013, Touria founded 154 Contemporary African Art Fair, held in London and New York on an annual basis. 154 has quickly emerged as Europe's original and leading art fair focusing on contemporary art from Africa and the African diaspora. Also joining us is Marcus Gora. Marcus is co-founder and director of First Floor Gallery Harare, a pioneering international contemporary art gallery with spaces in Harare and Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, which since 2009 has been at the forefront of developing local and international audiences and markets for emerging artists from Zimbabwe and beyond. Gore is also a manager for Makumba, Zimbabwe's top touring musical group, as well as the festival manager for the annual Jacaranda Music Festival in Zimbabwe. Over to you, Ayodeji.
Great. Good evening, Touria and Marcus. Very lovely to be in this conversation with the two of you today. Marcus, you said you're joining us from Zimbabwe, yes? And Touria, you're in London, and I'm in Nigeria.
Yes.
It's a great little trifecta. So I'm going to jump straight into it. I thought we might start this conversation with sort of like a little primer of sorts about the term itself, African art, which I find sometimes very like controversial. I don't know if you agree. Touria might not. So Africa.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No.
Right,
I mean, we're completely in agreement with you. It's very restrictive and limiting for a lot of things. But when it comes to art, when it comes to 154 particularly, I find it, in a way, a beautiful thing where we can find some kind of unity, to showcase and highlight, the power of the continent, So it's for me, it's very controversial even inside of me, where I really enjoy the power of it, for people to understand what we're trying to do here. But at the same time, I'm completely on the side of the artist when it comes to the limitation of this categorization.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's kind of like reflects what I want to sort of talk about as well, because I feel like I've read several pieces that says from a marketing and branding perspective, it's important that it's called African arts. Like we need something that draws attention of everyone else to it. But like you said, from the artist perspective, it feels like limiting, like they're put in a box where there's no room for diversity. There's no room for like, like a sort of a broader understanding of what African art means, So what I want to ask, and obviously we're using this term for a while now, and I think given that the understanding of African arts, quote unquote, has expanded in the last, let's say, 10 years, do you think it is still necessary from a branding and marketing perspective to still use, that term? And I'll throw that question to Marcus or Turia, if you could just, yeah. Marcus, you could go first.
So for me, can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Hello? Good. So for me,
yeah.
I think I've heard a lot of arguments, for and against. And I think, already automatically, if you are an African or a diasporan and you make art, or you are from Africa, whether on the continent or a bit removed, it still automatically is sort of African art or art from Africa. And the categories might help when it comes to carving out sort of market niches. It might help. But I think the problem starts when you then have who gets to name and categorize, and then who gets to gatekeep and decide what is and what is not. So that's where I think the problems sort of start to emerge. Is if it's for us by us, then it's great. But if it's then generated from somewhere and used to then narrow and exclude or limit, then that's a big problem. And we kind of see that in different examples.
And just to jump over to you, Turia, in just light of what Marcus has said, as someone who runs an organization who some might argue is in a sort of gatekeeping position, do you feel a responsibility to educate the markets, for instance, and other people, like other practitioners, when it comes to this term and like how it can be used and who's using it and things like that?
So, I always like to go back to 2013, when we started this, this initiative and what the market looked like, and the landscape looked like, which was completely different than where we're looking at it right now. When I talk to artists right now, I feel like their experience into entering the market is completely different. And I'm super happy about it, but in 2013, I think one of the things we wanted to do just with the title of 154 was to really underline actually that, we were talking about one continent, 54 countries, a multiplicity of creativity and, artists coming from different backgrounds, different political, geopolitical context, So this what we wanted the title to showcase, and really underline that we're not trying to pigeonhole anybody into this particular, African term. And I think that's why we called it 154. And until today, a lot of people have, question about the title. Some is ignorance, some is really not understanding what it is underlining. But this was, the key point of the title of the fair was really this, showcase of multiplicity and I guess in a way the grandeur of the African continent. But now when it comes to is it something needed today? Is it something that we still want every artist to be branded with? Of course not. But if it's a question of still having this power of engaging the international market and making sure they understand what they're coming to see when there's so many art shows in the world. And to be fair, I think number that we got pre-COVID 2018, there was 200 art fairs in the world. It was also to give it a more specific context in terms of what people would come to see in a week that was so full of other events. So for example, we chose to be around Freeze to make sure that there was this understanding and curiosity of other collectors coming to see what we're doing. But it was important for us in such a busy week, that people would understand that this was the differentiation, this is what we were about, this is what we were showing, this is who we're giving a voice to. And I think in that way, this branding was very important. And our first year, if we go back to the archive of 154 in 2013, we had a whole forum about what it meant to be African, and what it meant for artists, what it meant for people coming to visit the fair. And it was, a debate that was, I guess, really important to us. But we let, the 154 forum talk about it and discuss it and have artists, give their opinion on it. And there was nothing wrong about not being in agreement on this particular categorization. But for us, it was important to, highlight this continent by being together and showing a unity rather than like not being together. And, I don't think a fair on only Nigerian artists would have worked in London, where on only, Moroccan artists would have worked in London. So the interest, or the rise of the interest, was about the whole continent and showcasing, what the continent had to offer. Now, even with the evolution of the fair today, most of the people know it for 154, not the contemporary African art fair. And I hope this is where we're going, and I mean, we question our relevance every year, and the day, there will be I guess no more need of 154. I'm the first one to say that this. I'll be super happy that this will be the most beautiful death of 154. Is that there's no more, no more need for it. That there's a full integrated market. That is, the galleries are invited to every art fairs internationally. That emerging artists on the continent have platforms, and that will be an amazing world to my eyes.
Very, very poetically put, Turia. And I should even give some background myself, why I asked that question. I remember one time I was just in my work, I was sort of speaking to a gallerist from Nigeria, actually, who was showing artists who had a booth at Freeze. And I remember they said to me something that really struck me about how, showing at 154 is a kind of like niche category. Like people need to see artists with everybody else. And that really struck me because I just kept thinking, if we ourselves are thinking that, it just seemed like a very sort of problematic way to sort of approach, as to think about it. And to just throw this to you, Marcus, obviously this is 154 is African artists to the world. I imagine in Zimbabwe it's much different when you're speaking to the markets. Can you just sort of talk through how you approach the markets, how you speak to them, what kind of language they need to hear, to be interested in the artists there?
Thank you, Adu. Ayo, what Zimbabwe looks like in terms of the contemporary art scene is that, of course, you would have, and I would give this as an example for other countries like ours in the region and maybe with similar circumstances, is that you would start from an underinvestment in art education and the entire ecosystem. There just hasn't been enough sort of put into the art schools, put into encouraging sort of the development of a lot of private players who can then have galleries, and then you can have a cascading into either primary market players and secondary market players. So coming from that position, I think we started this gallery project with my co-founder Valerie Karpov in 2009, before the boom, slightly before the sort of African art boom, as people started to feel it around 2012-13. And the motivation at the time was just to say, we need to build our own sort of spaces. Because before, I thought the argument was slightly being lost, where we had curators and African players really knocking on the door and clamoring to get into sort of being accepted in more international platforms and more European institutions at the time. And I felt like, if you take a snapshot of the environment on the continent, you would find that there was not too many galleries, not too many museums, and we needed to start building infrastructure locally that would allow us to, with enough freedom, to push the artists that deserved it and the artists that were relevant to our context. So, another angle was that because there was no investment from, say, government, a lot of the funding that was bleeding into the space was coming from mostly developmental NGOs. And while the work that they were doing was important, the way that it impacted the art and creative space was that it was very top down. So they would come in with their goals to say, we are worried about sanitation, we are worried about the environment, we are worried about HIV/AIDS. So let's get all the artists to become these vehicles to communicate these messages to people. And so you find that a lot of the art then started to speak about these issues that were fundable and box ticking sort of issues, and less about what people were really thinking about and worrying about. in their local context. So in Zimbabwe, we felt like we had to then create an independent space that would allow artists to talk about the issues that they really cared about. We had a political situation that was volatile, economic situation that was volatile, and there were artists who wanted to talk about it in a way that they understand and in the way that translates into action in their communities. So that then became important, but we were feeling like we were slightly in competition with NGOs because, of course, they're coming from more established countries, more established organizations, and we started a gallery on $100. So there was no way that we could compete marketing-wise, and so we had to then sort of leapfrog certain developments or stages. So we started going to art fairs without any right to be honest. Like we had not really established ourselves, but we felt like we have to fund the project. So we split our project into half, where half is developmental. We have to train artists because they're coming from schools that were inadequate. But at the same time, we have to approach the market to get the money to be able to do what we wanted to do.
Develop.
So yeah, it took us a bit of time before we started really engaging with the international sort of space. But locally, also we had to develop audiences. So it was really like a really, I think, tough sort of push to get all those things going at the same time in the absence of too much support.
Right. And to talk about something you mentioned, the boom. And I want to jump back to Turia on this. Like between 2013 and now, how would you say the 154 collective, these people, this group of people that are sort of pushing African art towards, how have they evolved? And why do you think, it seems like this boom is in some kind of ascendancy? Is it a question of like the fact that access is not democratized now? Collectors can go on Instagram and find the arts that they like. Is it that it's just everything just seems to be coming together, like behind the scenes, like markets wise, galleries, all that stuff? Like how would you say the collectors evolved, and how would you say the market, African art itself, quote unquote, has evolved as well?
So to be fair, I think there was two moments. I mean, I think from 2013 to 2020, pre-COVID, I think we definitely had a very constant evolution of appreciation, of people being more interested. At least I can talk about, the engagement of our audience with 154, and people buying and coming from the continent, but also coming mainly from Europe and the US. And I think that after the COVID, and I mean, obviously, I know that the Black Lives Matter movement is not something that started, with George Floyd, but that attention that was brought by, that summer really made everybody realize, how important, I guess, inclusion and, having a larger collection meant from institution to collectors to things like that. And I mean, really this year, particularly, I saw a real appreciation in terms of prices, but also people not questioning it. That means that they would come to the fair and they were just like wanting to buy. It didn't matter what price. It didn't matter, if they didn't know the artist. It didn't matter if, they were just upset that there was not enough to sell. And to be honest, it was a bit of a special year because the galleries, the artists, were under really a huge pressure with this COVID, price, like in terms of production. The galleries also making sure that investment they were making into the fair really counted in terms of return because they had such a bad year previously. So they really also did an amazing effort pre-selling everything and making sure they contacted all their collectors. But what happened during this particular moment in London was that people wanted a lot of art and there was almost not enough, for the audience. And we saw different collectors, bigger collectors that never came to the fair, giving an interest. And you have to understand that, we are in a very busy week. So when international collectors come to London, for free, we get them, but the audience is also limited to people who knew 154 before, or like, we'd never have a huge budget to promote the fair, so it's really about word of mouth, people talking about us from Freeze to London. But I have to say this year it was really intense, not only in terms of attendance but in terms of collectors being upset not to have enough work. And really not caring about the prices. This is the first year really where I saw absolutely no question about the value of the artwork that was present at the fair. Previous years, they wanted to know more about the artist, not that they didn't want to pay for it, but they wanted to understand why it was valued at a certain price, even if to my eyes it's still undervalued. Collectors who had never heard about those names, were kind of questioning, what the artist, journey was, where they had, belonged to which collection, what kind of institution, had him or collected him. And I think this year was very, very different in terms of, we are, we know what we want to, acquire pieces, where are the pieces, African artists are important, etc. So I really felt that, in a way, I don't want to call it a boom, but there was no more questioning on prices. I still want to say, that I want to kind of like downplay it a bit, because when we talk about a boom, but when we are looking at the real numbers of sales, that are published, from time to time, we are so far away, in terms of percentage and what it represents than the global art market, in terms of that. And I mean, I want to give an example ways, to, I guess, pre-COVID, but let's take a year like 2019, which was, I guess, a regular year for us and the art world, how much things were sold, was no COVID, etc. I know for a fact that, if you take a fair like FIAC, for example, which was considered, quite an important fair in 2019, we had been in existence for somewhere around 7 or 8 years. Out of the 795 artists present at FIAC, there was only 33 that were African or from the African diaspora. That means, around 4%. So it's always a good number to remember where we are in those international art fairs and scale. Now, this year, I've been to Art Basel, Miami, and I saw Marcus there. And I mean, obviously, those numbers were different. The numbers of galleries accepted by Art Basel, Miami this year was, up the roof, compared to the previous years. So it's also maybe the mark of a huge change in terms of integration and acceptance of galleries from the continent. We'll see. It's also a return for, Art Basel in Miami, so maybe they also needed to fill in some spaces. I don't know, but there's definitely a switch, a change, and a real appreciation that we can, feel and touch and understand now.
And I'm this is really curious to mention this because I'm going to ask this like much later, but might as well just talk about it now. Talk to me, both of you, actually, about this undervaluation of African artists, because we could easily argue even modern works go for much less than artists from elsewhere in the world, right? And so what is, and this is obviously like this is probably an impossible question, what is an ideal approach that the art market starts to understand and value the production and creativity of African artists? Because are we then saying by implication that it took a racial uprising for people to understand that African works by African artists should be valued? If there's something to be done, to like change. So you see artists who have been established for years, who are going for maybe a quarter of what artists in their sort of same their contemporaries elsewhere in the world are going for. So like, how can that change? Really, Marcus, you can go first.
Well, I mean that's as a sort of a gallerist practicing on the continent. I mean that's a daily reality. And I never thought in my life that I would quote George Bush, because he had this what he called the soft bigotry of low expectations, and I think that's what we struggle with, because I would stack it like this: African artists represented by an African gallery, that's very low price. Then you have an African artist represented by an international gallery, maybe that gets a little bit better. And then maybe you have an African artist or African diaspora artist based internationally represented by an international gallery, another tier of pricing. So for us at the bottom of the pile, you have concerns about quality, concerns about education, concerns about whether the shipping will arrive, concerns about transactions, And as I mean, Zimbabwe is a bit isolated also because we have some undeclared sanctions, and so transactions become an issue. There are all these sort of hurdles that I feel are built into the pricing, and a big one is perception, and it's one of the things that we have had to work on, and I think some of it starts to shift. I mean, we are super grateful as a gallery because we did do the first, I think, 2 editions of 154, and Turia and team were really, really generous and helpful to, at least, like we got there, we were young, and we were trying to figure things out, but we got a lot of exposure, engaging with the international space, and also, I mean, the reason why I think at that point we had to pull out is because you start facing situations where African artists, because of their pricing, were easy to poach for international galleries. I don't know if that makes sense. That you have invested as a young gallery in putting, like you're all into developing a young promising artist. Then you are there at the international sort of stage with them, and you have not too much to offer. Then somebody picks them up who offers them like a sign on, not even too much money, and you're already in trouble. So we had to dial back a little bit, really look at buttressing, and work on perception and blah. And I think finally coming to Art Basel last year, again, it's a work on the perception to say, oh, if a gallery like this can be here, coming from Zimbabwe, then
that means something.
It starts to mean something. And I think the work that all the people involved in the sort of African art, if we call it that, space, from curators to gallerists to museums have been pushing in that direction, where all of a sudden the whole, it's just discovery, it's just something new and it's a fad, it'll go away, is slowly starting to change. And I feel like people are now seeing the quality, they're seeing the relevance, and the importance, and I think that will keep driving the price.
And for you, Turia, like from a fair perspective, and in this sort of equation for an organization that has a bit more power, where does 154 go between the time when collectors are questioning prices and now when something outside of the arts markets world has sort of made them, then realize that this is important? Like, what can 154 do to say collectors, actually, this is worth these amounts?
So, I mean, for me, when I see it, I mean, I've seen galleries, present in 2013, and First Floor was there, but like they were presenting, very, I'll say shyly, the work of artists that had never been shown before. It was their first international exhibition, etc. So the prices were really, to be honest, fair and based on the entry level of the artist. It was the first show. They didn't price at 20,000 pound, the price of a young artist. And I think that was, very valuable at the time as well, because there was a learning curve, there was an education that we were doing. And this is what you have to remember about 154. A lot of the galleries that were launched, and I don't want to say launched because they were launched in their country, but launched on the international stage, it was their first experience as much as it was our first experience. So the whole education about participating out of there, hanging on the walls, not having too much, showcasing like you would see at international art fair, was part of the learning curve for all of us. And to be fair, I understand exactly Marcus' point, but this is the global story of every young artist. They're being poached by bigger galleries. So it's not an African concept, it's an international, concept. You have the young gallery who usually, push a young artist, work with them, develop the relationship. As soon as it's bankable, you have a bigger gallery coming and picking them up and taking them to the next level. This is what we see here all the time. What I've seen though is like having galleries much more, and I think you've done that also, Marcus and First Floor, but negotiating better condition by the sharing of artists, or okay, you want that artist, but I'll still represent them, for Africa and maybe for Europe or whatever. So they've been like better deals that galleries who have done several art fairs that are able to talk to their neighbor at art fairs, to see how to deal with artists as well, to make sure that the artist is happy in that relationship with the galleries based on the continent, but can also move to the other level in terms of the other level of collectors, of relationship to institutions. And these are important. I'm not saying that a gallery from the continent cannot do it, but what we know and what we have observed is like collectors in the US, institution of the US, this is where the biggest art market is, so those are important factors, for the journey of an artist. If we really wanted to see a great change on the continent with appreciation on the continent, we would have to develop a very strong collector base. And I'm not saying it's not possible. It is very possible because a large number of young, millionaire and billionaires are coming from the continent now. But it's about, creating our own power of collectors that can sustain and support the market. So locally, there's also a strong, art market as much as there is one, in the US. So it would be interesting to see, like in 20 years, that there's so many institutions on the continent that for an artist to be successful, he can be successful on the continent. He doesn't have to be in the US to belong to the most important collector, to get those kind of prices. And I mean, to be honest, the reality today is that if you're successful and you're able to make it, at a higher level of entry prices, like Amoako, Boafo, for example, or things like that, it's all triggered by international collectors and American collector, to be more specific, that is taking, that artist, make a fuss about having it in his collection, giving him a residency, in the US, and that really triggers a different, experience. And I mean, the reality is that the power of the American market is there, so if an artist is supported in America coming from the continent, it will have a different, impact on his journey. I'm not saying that the journey and the appreciation and the value cannot happen, if you're based on the continent, but I'm just saying there's different networks and factors in the US that make this journey more likable in a way.
Easier.
Yeah. So that's my view on it.
Cool. I will say, I'll jump to the next question, but just point out, I will feel sort of led to say one thing. I do think there are, and I'm preaching, but I do think there are ways in which, African artists are required to prove themselves. We have seen young British artists who just started their careers, who start 1-2 years commanding really high figures. That happens, or in America as well, So I don't know that African artists have to be the exception. Like, even artists that haven't shown anywhere, who like just on sheer talent alone, able to command certain prices. But what you said to the point, Turia, about a stronger collector base on the continent. Another economic reality is most African galleries are sort of, and I've seen this in my reporting when I go to fairs and speak to galleries and things like that. People want to now start pegging the value of their artists' works to the dollar, when the reality of most African countries is they come from countries where their currency, not necessarily by the collector's design, is weaker. So what this means is we're seeing, and I've seen galleries in Nigeria at least talk about this, where local collectors are increasingly being priced out of works by the artists from their countries, just by the nature of the economic system, where the dollar is much stronger, the naira is weaker, the rand is weaker, the city is weaker. So how does, both from the gallery perspective, Marcus, and Turia from a fair perspective, how do you, again, probably another impossible question, how do you navigate this issue while protecting the artist market value as well? Because what I hear is that we can't price the works at one price at 154, and then it's a different price in naira in Nigeria. So it's almost like, something sort of has to something has to give, So yeah, how do you, Marcus, can start? How do you work with that? And in your experience as well with First Floor.
Thank you. I mean, it is a bit of a difficult sort of conundrum, because because we've been moving, I think, year on year for about 12 years. Was to make sure that the prices are not jumping up too fast. Like, there's a temptation that once an artist starts to get some kind of attention, we had artists who we're getting into, say, New Museum Trinali, and demand sort of picks up, and then all of a sudden, the temptation is there to jump. But for local collectors, there has to be a deliberate policy to try to handhold and to try to take care of them. Because while, I will touch on what Turia was saying, yes, it's important to look at the market and how, say, America can push the market, but there are also artists who are just important in their countries because of what they represent and what they're doing there in terms of creating dialogue, protest. There's another value beyond market that artists sort of present in their countries, and it's really important to safeguard their place by not then sort of sometimes pushing too fast, but allowing the works to stay in the country, and because a lot of it will just go right. If an artist, we have artists who have become successful here in Zimbabwe who cannot show here anymore because the international gallery rules will say that nobody can visit their studio, they can't have a show here because then the price, nothing makes sense, right? So there has to be some deliberate attempts to make sure that the work is seen by the audiences that it's speaking to. And as a gallery, I think we do try to make payment plans. We try to make some arrangements that will allow local collectors to have at least sometimes first dibs on works, and at least be able to participate in a fairer way, allowing for the distortions that you're talking about in terms of pricing and in terms of incomes, and that has been super important. I think also allowing artists to, in our gallery, exchange works, build collections of each other's work has been another way to just bypass the sort of complexity that comes with like prices going too high. Some collaborations, of course, with other galleries would demand that they show works at a certain price because they are in a capital that is more expensive. They pay more in real estate, blah, blah. So it has to be deliberate. I think that's what I think is we have to work with even national institutions here and local companies like we're trying to do in our context to, again, encourage them to create collections of local artists and have at least places where this art is actually seen. Because again, no use in my mind of having sales and nobody gets to see anything. It gets vaulted. So I think art is serving a purpose on the continent that is really right now, and the representation of works when it comes to international audiences can also mean different things. So for example, some people see Black figuration as pretty pictures, but in other places they'll see narratives and storytelling and metaphors that mean something deep and meaningful in the societies that these images emerge from. So there has to be just a balanced sort of navigation of the terrain to make sure that it satisfies both the market but also function in society.
And Terry, I wanted you to think about it as Marcus responded to think, maybe approach the question through the context of 154 Marrakesh in particular, for instance, and maybe your vision for the continent going forward. I don't know whether 154 has more plans to do more work, collaborations, initiatives on the continent like 154 Marrakesh, and what that looks like, engaging with the local African markets.
So I mean, Marrakesh, was always, I wouldn't say Marrakesh itself, but having a space on the continent was really in the card from the beginning. Actually, when I thought through 154 was actually, that was my idea of 154, was like, it will start on the continent and basically be this, nomadic fair on the continent where each country could welcome 154, the football game, the Arabic Nation, Cup or whatever, something like that. Obviously, more I went into research, created the business plan, more talking to some of the existing galleries and their problematic on on the continent, in terms of not selling enough to the local, I guess, collector base, but more to the international expat communities. They were more keen to participate in an international art fair than a local art fair. So I knew I had to put, let's say, the location on the continent for a bit later and start with the international market. I learned that, while I was working through, the project of 154. So yes, we wanted a city on the continent. We wanted a city that, we knew had to welcome still an international base of collectors, because we wanted to make sure that it was successful enough for the galleries to come to the continent and do the fair. So there's a certain, understanding of guarantee of sales, when a galleries come to 154. So we know it's a huge investment for them, but we want to make sure that, in return, we make sure that it's, a platform where we are welcoming collectors, that we can make sure that there will be sales happening. So for us, creating a space, in the city, on the continent, but that could still welcome a large number of international collectors was very important. So Marrakesh is definitely, responding to all those criteria. It's easy to access. It is, in the way, very, very interesting for people to come to see. There's an amazing local art scenes that people can discover. And I think in terms of easiness to access, it provided this. There's still different little, complexities of import and export, of work, but everybody, that is doing Marrakesh, and this is where we understand also, we have the same understanding with the African galleries, is that we all in this for the long term. So it is a bit more complex on the continent, but we all know it's important that we are there. So yes, it's not as easy as importing and exporting, in London or in New York or in Paris, but yes, we understand that, we have to spend a bit more time, maybe a bit more money, but it is important that this is happening, that there's in a way, a precedent that is happening, that the government understands, the importance of art, and culture in their country. So we know how important it is. So we want to continue Marrakesh. This was our biggest hope this year, to be able to do it and return after 1 year of absence. But unfortunately, the borders of Morocco stayed closed until the 7th of February. So very hard for us to get that visibility to organize an event and make sure that people get back into the concept of traveling, for 4 days art weekend, which they are less and less, right now keen on doing. I'm sure it's coming back. It's just for the moment, it's not possible. So we had to take the very sad decision to cancel this year again, like last 2 weeks ago. But the reality is that for us, it's much more important, the work we do on the continent, in terms of developing the art scene, making sure that we are encouraging collectors from the continent to come, and see what we're doing on the continent. Our, work with the different institutions in Marrakesh, but also the different cultural platforms that are there. And what is beautiful about it is that the whole city is working with us on this. We are, obviously bringing the fair there, bringing the collectors, but what the city is giving us, the local, platforms are giving us, is so much more than what London is giving us, or, Paris or New York is giving us. Everybody's putting their best foot forward, showing their best, exhibition. We are able to create a program for the people coming to visit Marrakesh on that particular period that is beyond what we can do in London and New York. And it's locally based. People can go see Artists Institute. There's residency of artists, there locally. So to be honest, it is an amazing, engagement and project. And we want to continue to be able to do that. And I mean, I hope we could do collaboration with other countries. I think that, for my team and I, 3 fairs is as much as we can do per year, to do different kind of possibility. I think this is something we envision with, the possibility to maybe do curated show during the Biennale of Dakar, like going to Nigeria. But you have to also understand that those countries like Nigeria, like South Africa, they also have very good, art fairs. So we don't want to go and compete with the local, local well-grown, platform that is doing an amazing job locally. So it's also where we were able to come. Marrakesh and North Africa became also very strategic in their geography positioning, but also in their place on the continent. Often people don't understand that North Africa is part of Africa as well, so this was also for us a very good way to engage North African artists and North African collectors. What we've seen by being also in Marrakesh, which was very exciting, is we had galleries from Morocco now representing artists from, Africa that are not Moroccan artists, and we have also galleries from Ghana, for example, who took on, international, artists. When I say international African artists, but they are representing, artists from, Sudan, or artists from Tunisia, or we've seen this collaboration of increasing, I guess, the scope of what they call, the stable of their artists. It's not just Ghanaian artists now. They have a few, artists that are not from Ghana, but from different places in Africa. And we have galleries in Morocco who are doing the same. So this is influencing also how, the market is reacting to us, on the continent, and also what the galleries are figuring out themselves. They might not just want to represent, North African artists or Moroccan artists or, Nigerian artists, but they might want to enlarge the scope of representation of artists from the continent, which is beautiful to see.
Right. Thank you for that. And speaking about the markets, Marcus, I want you to just quickly talk to us about the Zimbabwean markets and the regional market, Southern African markets as well. Like, what is first floor strategy, for instance, in engaging with that? What is that market like? I ask that because one could argue, for instance, the fact that you have two locations is presumably the fact that there's something going on that allows you to have two locations, to cater to the markets in Zimbabwe and larger in the region as well. So yeah, talk to us about that.
Thank you. So in the local context, we are in the capital of the city, and there's a lot that happens here that is more. It's the administrative capital. So of course, there are all the sort of banks, companies, individuals who are engaging with the space and what we're trying to do. But we have set up shop in Victoria Falls, which is a more international hub in the sense that they just built a new large airport, and before COVID would get many arrivals from different places, and it's just kind of a place where we think we can get more collective visits, because we used to, before COVID, also have collective visits as another stream of how we were engaging with the market. But then Harare is a bit constrained, and it's not really set up to host all that much. There's, you can do 2 days, but then past that, I don't think there's too much to see. So we were trying to mix the whole sort of tourism and collecting advantages that Victoria Falls has. But part of our broader strategy has been that we are part of an association. So we, way before COVID, had started an emerging African Galleries Association, which is now just African Galleries Association, which has galleries from across the continent, really, but emerging with the same experience, similar sort of stature. And we've been using that platform to learn about all the other places. So when I'm speaking with kind of a knowledge of what's happening at our level across the continent, and at the same time using that group to be kind of like a bargaining sort of group, so we can bargain with fairs, we can bargain with platforms like Artsy, online platforms, blah, blah, to get sort of good deals, and also just cut across the Lusophone, Francophone, Anglophone divisions that you see on the continent and mix it up. And we have come up with a painting prize called Emerging Painting Prize, which has been doing really well for the past 3 years, identifying emerging talent to feed into some of the galleries and just develop more opportunities. So we have been trying to engage in exchanges, cross exhibitions, to allow us to have a foot and a learning in different markets, and that has worked. One of our artists just did a residency in December at Selma Feriani Gallery in Tunisia, and did an exhibition after, and it was well received. So that's another way of then crossing, the continent and being engaged. And of course, in South Africa, it's a more robust ecosystem. So they have good art fairs. and we have good gallery relationships with some galleries. So it's been kind of an all-out effort to touch everywhere and use the networks and the experience of others to sort of deliver a lot for the artists that we represent.
All right, cool. And one more thing I wanted to ask, even though we have just 5 minutes left, so we have to ask this really quickly, is how does the political climate in Zimbabwe affect the kind of work that can be shown and sold there? I was doing some research into First Floor, and I remember seeing something that really struck me about, and I'll read this to you, actually. I'm not sure whether you know this exists. So this is about First Floor. The gallery has a regular exhibition program and an education platform with a genuine focus on experimentation and freedom of speech, engagement, and diversity, all vetted for appropriateness by the people's governments under the guidance of Commander Mugabe. I imagine this was written when he was alive. And so I was really just curious to know, and being that some people, some observers from the outside of Zimbabwe might assume or refer or believe that the current government there is also dictatorial as well. How does it affect the art markets, affect the artists who have been producing work before they can even bring it to markets in the first place?
So I had not come across that as in the vetting part, but we have been. Of course, there is some element of sort of censorship and self-censorship if you have a very polarized environment like the one that exists here. But in our experience, we've been able to be a really free space where everyone is welcome, and from all sort of walks of life, diversity in every sense. And we haven't, I think, because contemporary art is not as popular as other art forms, like music, for example, it flies under the radar a little bit. So we have been able to move in those spaces and still allow artists to do their best and say whatever they want to say. So we have never had any censorship or any closing down of any exhibition as such. And I think Zimbabwe, which is a very long conversation, is a bit misunderstood in many ways. And there are on the ground sort of realities that are slightly different from a simple narrative of, this is a tempered dictatorship, poor country from Africa. So there are nuances, and we have been sort of skillful enough to be able to navigate those waters and make sure that we continue to deliver a free space for artists and everyone, because audience is included. Yeah.
Right, cool. We have like seconds left, so I guess to ask this really quickly. What would you say, Toria and Marcus, your predictions are for the art market as it concerns African artists in 2002, in the rest of the next 11 months? What do you hope to see happen, or what do you think will happen as it concerns the African arts markets? Toria, you can go first.
Well, I hope, that we are, all very, in a way, realistic about this market, and we're all working with, sustainability, in mind, and longevity. This is what I hope for, I guess, this new appreciation and excitement about contemporary African art. I mean, to be fair, I'm very excited, for a lot of the change in that landscape. For me, the most exciting part when I was interviewing this panelist, at 154 at the talk where we had a young artist coming out from St. Martin's, in school here from Nigeria. She had like a whole different experience. She was not categorizing herself as an African artist. She wanted to be a surrealist artist. She had 154 in mind, but she had other choices. And this is the beauty about it, is that it's completely changing. You have artists who grew up with the 154. It's been there and there all the time. They've been starting their journey as an artist. They never had this maybe doubt that they will have a hard career because they had no platform for their work. For their work. So I mean, this is for me just amazing to see, and I hope continue with, I guess, this dedication and commitment of institutions, of collectors, of obviously international galleries, international art fairs, to really make sure there's an integration, there's an inclusion of all those artists from the continent and the African diaspora, and basically maybe a more fair appreciation, of those artists compared to international, artists.
All right, thank you. And Marcus, you're going to close us out.
I agree with Turia. Thank you.
That's it? All right. Thank you very much, guys. This was a very lovely conversation. I learned quite a bit from this. It was lovely chatting to you. And I look forward to seeing what both the organizations will do in the coming year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, great. And have a good evening. Well, or morning, depending on when you're watching.
I want to thank all of today's amazing panelists. MoAD's Engage Symposium is only possible due to all of you generously lending your time to these important discussions. On behalf of MoAD staff, board of directors, and members, thank you so much. I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining today's program. We hope that you left with more insight into the world of contemporary African art, and more importantly, we hope you are inspired and curious to learn even more. We invite you to return to the virtual networking room to interact with one another and keep the conversations going. We will leave the space open for the next hour. If you love today's program, please consider becoming a MoAD member. If you are already a member, please consider making a donation to MoAD. Our membership dues and donations help us to keep programs like our annual Engage Symposium free or low cost. For more information on becoming a member or to make a donation, please visit www.moadsf.org, MoADSF.org, and click the orange Support Us button. Again, thank you so much for spending your day with us. We hope to see you at MoAD soon. Until then, be well.